Książka Propagandysta, który przechytrzył Hitlera, jak wygrać wojnę informacyjną, Aleksandra Paszkowska przetłumaczyła. Kiedy po raz pierwszy spotkałeś Seftona Delmera na swojej drodze?
When have I met him? Literally? Or kind of...
No,
because I do feel I've met him. I have a lot of conversations with him. I talk to him quite a lot, which is what happens when you write about a historical character. And I was actually going to have parts of the book where I literally talk to him, but then I was too much of a literary coward to do that sort of thing, because that would have been pure imagination. And in a book about the difference between truth and lies, I felt I had to stay this side of non-fiction. So I haven't actually met him in person. He's dead.
Ale jak go poznałeś, kiedy po raz pierwszy spotkałeś się z tą postacią w swoim życiu?
So I remember it very well. It was 2014-15. Russia had just invaded Crimea, and I was in a room full of British civil servants, very famous editors, academics, all discussing how do we stop Russian disinformation. So since then we all talk about this, but this was one of the first few meetings where people were coming up with a plan. And there was a guy in the corner, I can't say his name, but a senior British official with an academic background, who halfway through said, we're all talking about the wrong thing. Instead of countering disinformation, we should be doing to them what they do to us. And then that was the first time he said the name Sefton Delmer, and said, historically, we've done this very well. And everybody in the room looked at him shocked and appalled. You know, this idea that we would be doing something scandalous like that. But that was the first time I'd heard the name, and then I started doing research about him. You're getting the translation? Yeah.
Jeżeli ktoś potrzebuje tłumaczenia, to mamy słuchawki oczywiście do odbioru tam, a później też do oddania, o czym też już od razu przypomnę. Dlaczego Sefton Delmer jest tak ważną postacią dla osób zajmujących się informacją, propagandą, depropagandą może, bo to również jest tematem twojej książki.
So he kind of, for the professionals who work in this space, whether countering propaganda or creating your own propaganda, he's a genius. And what do we mean by the word genius? It's a very overused word. The way I use the word genius is someone who was so important to their field that they changed it. You know, there's the novel before Joyce and after Joyce. There's propaganda before Sefton Delmer and after Sefton Delmer. And everybody who works with him understands this. The way that he thought about the role of identity in propaganda, the way he thought about changing behavior rather than just ideas, the way he thought about types of thinking rather than just the surface message. All of these were huge innovations. The way he wanted to climb inside propaganda and manipulate it from inside rather than countering it. All of these were things that were huge innovations, even though he was never a theoretician. But everybody who works in the field professionally, both for the evil side, so the head of the DDR propaganda would force all his students to read Delmer, or whether you work at it from the side of democracies, they all know him. there is a separate room in the British army that works on psychological operations. But outside of this tiny community, his memory has been completely forgotten.
Dzięki tobie wszyscy poznaliśmy Delmera, ale to, co mówisz, że on był teraz jest ważną postacią dla wielu osób, jednak zanim zaczął pracę w Anglii, zanim zaczął pracę dla wywiadu, no nie był dobrze widziany. Musiał przejść jednak długą drogę do tego, żeby być zaakceptowanym także w kraju, który w jakiś sposób wybrał na miejsce swojego życia.
Well, Delmer felt that because he was bicultural, because he'd grown up in Germany, because he'd worked a lot in Germany, which gave him this incredible understanding of Germany, he felt that he wasn't trusted by the British establishment. He felt that they saw him as not one of us. And it was very personal, because as a child, he was from a British family, but he grew up in Germany, where he was bullied for being English. This was during World War I. So he was this outsider growing up in Germany. Then he moved back to England when he was 10, and he was accused of being German. And he felt completely unaccepted. And he carried that wound very, very deeply. So when he grew up, and he wasn't trusted by the British establishment, he felt that wound was repeating. But this kind of status of an insider who's an outsider is also his talent. He could both see inside German group psychology, Nazi group psychology, and understand its dynamics, and he could see it from the outside and deconstruct it. So as someone who's had two, or maybe even more than two identities, that was also his talent. You know, he could crawl into and imagine different identities and start to undermine them. So it was both his blessing in terms of his work, but also his curse, because he always felt like an outsider. Until the end of his life, he always felt like an outsider.
Czy to jest również opowieść o tobie? Czujesz, że to jest historia podobna jak twojego życia?
So this is my most personal book, which is strange, because in my first two books, I use myself as the narrator. So that's my first two books, I am the main character. But that was done in a very, very impersonal way. That was a very, very disciplined use of myself as a camera. And actually, I don't know if you've all read my first two books, I actually only use myself to make some sort of argument. So my first book was about my life in Moscow, and it's all about me, but very, very strictly doing one thing. You find out nothing about my marriage, my children, all my real life is not there. My professional life is there, and that's it. So it's very funny, when you put yourself in a book, you're very controlled about this. Because you don't want to be self-indulgent. Nobody actually cares about you. They care about the story. In this book, I'm hardly there, and for the first time I got to pour all of my own feelings into it. Because I share some of them with Delmer. Not many, but enough to understand him. I think our fascination with propaganda comes from the same place. When you move a lot as a child, as I did as well, you start to see how constructed identities are. You understand that every role you inhabit in life, every language you learn, is a performance, where either you can impose yourself and be free, or you can play the role defined by others, by culture and by propaganda. And so my fascination with propaganda is that, when are we free? When are we ourselves? When are we the ones who are getting words to obey our call? Or when are we under the influence of others? And Delmer was fascinated by this as well. So in that sense, we're similar. and that's where the similarity ends. But in that one thing, we're very similar.
Wychowany w Niemczech, wrócił do Wielkiej Brytanii, gdzie skończył studia i następnie podjął pracę zawodową dla magazynów angielskich i został wysłany, właściwie sam chyba to zaproponował, że będzie nadawał z Berlina, gdzie mówimy o Delmerze, oczywiście nie o Peterze Pomerantsewie, i stamtąd zaczął pisać o nazistach, o drodze Hitlera do władzy, ale jego pomysłem dość specyficznym i oryginalnym na dojście do jak najbliższej informacji było niejako zaprzyjaźnienie się z nazistami. Zresztą organizował przyjęcia, walczył o to, żeby mieć wywiad z Hitlerem, co mu się też udało i miał te wywiady w miarę na wyłączność. Jak oceniasz w ogóle tę drogę Delmera?
So Delmer was the most famous foreign correspondent of his time. And he innovated in this space a lot. Have you guys heard of Tintin?
Yeah.
So he was like, and have you heard of Borat?
Yes.
So Delmer was basically a mix of Tintin and Borat. So he would go on these incredible adventures to the Spanish Civil War with Hemingway, going undercover among the Nazis. But his kind of trick was dressing up, a bit like Borat, and disguising himself in these environments and creating these provocations. So he was a bit like Sacha Baron Cohen and an investigative journalist at the same time. And he would disguise himself and take part in Nazi rallies pretending to be a Nazi and so on. So he was very immersive as a journalist, and I think very pioneering, and a superstar. I mean, he was legendary. The Daily Express at the time was the most popular newspaper in Britain. Its owner, Lord Beaverbrook, was like Murdoch. Delmer was advising him, so he had political influence. I mean, he was, I don't know, Anne Applebaum, that kind of person. You know, like, he was somebody with a huge platform and huge influence. But at the same time, he was always, I think, drawn to the dark side, you know. So his early memoirs talk about how he's drawn to First World War German propaganda. In his coverage of the Nazis, you know, his argument is that to get a story, you have to be ready to shake hands with the devil. So he becomes friends with Ernst Röhm, with Goering, and he hosts these famous parties. But the parties get pretty nasty. I mean, you know, you have Hanstengel and Goering singing kind of fascist, anti-Semitic songs till 1 a.m. And Delmer's argument was always, this is my way to get a story from them. But a lot of Delmer's friends were shocked. They were kind of like, what the fuck is this party? What are you having? And later on, in his memoirs that he writes in the 60s, Delmer makes it very clear that this was him just manipulating the Nazis. But the people who knew him at the time, they felt that, not that he was a Nazi or anything, but he was a little bit too comfortable with the dark side. So, I don't know to what extent a bit of him was ready to indulge these people's company. We'll never know to what extent he enjoyed it, you know. But to be clear, we're talking about the 1920s here. By the time the Nazis come into power, he's their biggest critic immediately, and they expel him from the country. So we're talking about the 20s here, when they're still in opposition. The minute they get near power, he actually takes a very strong position, partly because he knows them well. He's like, I know these guys, I know what they want, there will be war in Europe. He's writing cables to the British government going, prepare for war now, the moment the Nazis are in power. And you could say that because he knew them so well, he had zero delusions about that this was heading to a massive war immediately. So he was very clued up about them. He understood their power. Did he like drinking all night with Ernst Röhm and going to transvestite cabarets? He may have enjoyed himself.
Czy jak pisałeś o Seftonie Delmerze, korzystałeś z jego pamiętników, korzystałeś z jego autobiograficznych zapisków opublikowanych po wojnie, a czy zestawiałeś je z jakimiś informacjami od strony właśnie nazistowskich Niemiec, jak on był tam widziany, jak on był przez nich rozumiany, czy oni go rozgryźli i też grali z nim w grę, czy jednak mu ufali?
Yeah, so a lot of the time, and this is a book about disinformation, propaganda, and obviously Delmer's own autobiography, which he writes in the 60s, is him telling a story about himself. So I often cross-check it. I cross-check it with his articles, you know, because in his articles at the time, he sounds pretty impressed with Hitler, yeah, which he would say was him getting access away. So I cross-check with that. I cross-check with the things that people say about him, and then I kind of leave it to the reader. I mean, quite a few of the chapters are like collages. I'm like, here's how Delmer tells the story. Here's actually what he sounded like in his newspaper articles. Here's what the secret cables the British were writing about this were saying. The Nazis, hilariously, thought they were using him because they were convinced he was a British spy. And they thought they could communicate to Beaverbrook and bits of the British government through Delmer. And I'd say they were half right. He was not a real spy. We know that because we have his MI5 files and his SIS files, and they didn't trust him for a long time. So he definitely wasn't a spy in that sense. But he was writing to his boss, Lord Beaverbrook. Again, he was like Murdoch. He might as well have been a minister. So in that sense, he did have channels of influence in London. But the main thing the Nazis wanted from him was for the British to approve the SA joining the regular army and police force. So he was meant to. Ernst Röhm wanted Delmer to convince the British that they should be okay about the growth of the stormtroopers. But yes, everybody was using everybody else. Totally.
Wyobrażasz sobie dzisiaj takiego dziennikarza jak Delmer, kogoś, kto robi podobne rzeczy? Czy dzisiaj mamy już jednak inne też zasady w mediach i to jest coś, co nie mogłoby się wydarzyć?
So there's more channels now, apart from journalists were just much more powerful then. A foreign correspondent was a very privileged role, and it was almost like a cross between a diplomat and a politician and a spy. So probably less likely, but somebody like Rory Stewart in England is someone like that. They are a diplomat, a kind of spy, a writer, a soldier. I mean, historically, maybe your current foreign minister was a journalist once, you know. But that's but again, it happens around wars, doesn't it? Rory Stewart, I don't know if you know him, he's a very famous British public figure, went on to be a minister. Again, that's around Afghanistan. I think this happens around wartime when everybody's doing many jobs, when the lines between journalism and patriotism start to blur. When a journalist will say it's my war too. So I think in Ukraine you'll see a lot of this now. Are some of the famous journalists? Are they diplomats? Are they spies? I think when we move towards war, everybody's roles change. But the idea of a journalist being super privileged, having access to high power, being treated with respect, that's definitely over.
Unfortunately. A teraz przeskoczmy kilka lat do przodu. Sefton Delmer jest już zaangażowany w budowę stacji radiowych, które mają dezinformować Niemców. Jaki był jego pierwszy pomysł? Bo wiemy z książki, że on uległ zmianie.
So Delmer, one of the reasons I decided to write the book is Delmer faced a challenge that we all face today, not just in wartime. I think today we call it being trapped in the liberal echo chamber. The sense that liberal media, some of whom are represented in this room, we all just talk to ourselves and our own audiences, and we don't reach the audiences that follow authoritarian leading populists, let alone extremist movements. And that was Delmer's argument. He was basically saying that liberal exiled German media, British media that tried to talk to the Germans, so the BBC German service, they were all trapped in an echo chamber talking to themselves. And we needed to find a way to reach the people who were Hitler's followers, who liked Hitler, and we needed to start to undermine that relationship in order to undermine Germany's war efforts. So that was his starting point. There is no point preaching democracy to fascists. There is no point talking about the virtues of liberal values to people who have rejected them. This feels nice, but it is completely ineffective. And his great insight is like, I am not going to talk about nice things. I'm not going to talk about democracy. I don't care about making these people good. And instead, I'm going to use the worst in people and the techniques of Nazi propaganda against it. I'm going to appeal to anger, resentment, hatred, conspiracy theories, fear, and direct that against the Nazis. And it was a very innovative position. No one had ever made that argument before. And it's a very, very challenging argument about human nature. Because Delmer is essentially saying, we're not good people. You know, this is what the intro to his memoir is all about, which I come back to throughout the book. He's basically saying that essentially most people are bad. And you can preach to them about democracy and values, but it's not going to work for most people. And that's a very unpleasant thing to admit, but he may have a point. And we see it over and over today. I mean, I live in America. We've spent 12 years, liberal journalists like me, trying to convince Trump voters that he's a danger to democracy. I even did a big podcast series for The Atlantic with Ann Applebaum about the risks Trump poses to democracy. Did it reach any of his voters? Of course not. They don't give a fuck about democracy. They don't care about it. They've rejected it. We see it in the polling. They think the president should override the courts. They say it openly. What are we trying to convince them of? And what has destroyed the MAGA propaganda? Their own anti-Semitism, their own conspiracy theories around Epstein's Island. It's their own narratives turned back on themselves, which have started to destroy them. And that's what Delmer was doing. His radio shows would be presented by far-right soldiers who are even more radical than Hitler, who would spread conspiracies about the Nazi elite, who would say that they were all secret Bolsheviks, who would accuse them of being too weak, who would accuse them of being corrupt and not living up to their own ideals, in order to undermine the relationship between the Nazi leadership and soldiers, Nazi leadership and citizens. So that's what he started with. His main form of communication was pornography. So the shows were full of very, very bright sadomasochistic orgies. So again, not like the BBC. The BBC had Thomas Mann talking about philosophy. Delmer's radios had sadomasochistic orgies. So Guess who got the more listeners? And so yeah, that's what he started with. But then you're quite right, he evolved over time.
Czy to jest w jakimś stopniu opowieść o końcu idealizmu? Bo wczoraj słuchaliśmy, przynajmniej niektórzy z nas słuchali, premiera Donalda Tuska na imprezie Człowiek Roku Gazety Wyborczej, który mówi o tym, że te nasze idee dotyczące wolności, demokracji, humanizmu, że one dzisiaj nie wystarczą i że... A to nie był alarm. Dobrze. To wracamy do tego, że wartości, do humanizmu, demokracji, otwartości, że one już dzisiaj nie wystarczą i może to jest moja translacja jego słów, ale trzeba się wziąć za to wszystko silną ręką i zacząć jakby nie myśleć w taki sposób typowy dla tradycyjnego socjaldemokraty. To było takie przemówienie właściwie w tym kierunku. Czy twoja książka właśnie też o tym trochę nie jest, że czas na koniec świata idealistów?
We can go back to the idealism. No, look, if we're talking about a full spectrum information ecosystem, of course you need the good. Of course you need the ideals. Of course you need the institutions. We're very good at that. It's not enough though. I think the way we think about winning the information wars of the 20th century, we just like to remember the nice bits. You know, the sort of Thomas Mann on the BBC, or you know, Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty talking about democratic values and, I don't know, whatever, and censored literature. There was always another side. We always did the whole thing. And I think at a time when democracy is under threat, and where our enemies think about this like a war, we have self-censored how we really won the 20th century. And we won it by also being able to be very effective when it was necessary, and very hard when it was necessary, and completely ruthless when it was necessary. That doesn't mean about being unidealistic or whatever, it just means about doing things that work. Take the example of Moldova right now. Moldova, population 2 million, just won a very effective information war against Russia that spent 10% of the Moldovan budget trying to rig the election. And they did it by doing everything. They talked about ideals, democracy, rights. Fantastic, beautiful. That has to be there. And then they also did incredible law enforcement operations, arrested people, understood who was doing illegal things, blocked them, found ways to split the Russian vote. You've got to do the whole thing. Democrats have slightly... Go back to Martin Luther King. We remember the nice thing, like, oh, little kids holding hands. He was completely ruthless. Ruthless. Look at his letters from the Birmingham jail. Hard strategy. We get rid of anyone who's too soft. We only go for confrontations that will cause violence against us. Completely ruthless, understanding how you put the other side in dilemma situations and undermine them. So I think that we've got this sort of like picture that we won the 20th century by being nice, by talking about ideals. And we forget about actually that it was a case of making very effective strategies.
Jaka była ewaluacja, używając języka XXI wieku, działań Delmera? Na czym polegała? Jakie były jego efekty? I czy Niemcy po wojnie również pamiętali o tym, co on robił?
So, Delmo always saw what he was doing as part of a larger strategy, and that's the way it should be. So whether it's in war or in politics, the information propaganda is only as effective as your kinetic operations, your economic warfare, your political strategy. So these things never exist separately. They're always part of one, and integrating them is what makes you effective. So he would never have seen it, you know, if we hadn't had success on the Western Front, the propaganda wouldn't have worked either. So in terms of, there's different ways of measuring effect in communication. It's famously quite hard. Number one is what we would call ratings. So the way the British measured that is they did sociology, they did sort of little polls among POWs, German POWs who were captured. Am I going too fast? No, good. Sometimes I go too fast. But so over 50% of German soldiers listened to Delma's radio. So imagine we could get over half of peace voters or Konfederacja voters reading Gazeta Wyborcza. Or let's say we could get over half Russian soldiers listening to Ukrainian and partner media. Yeah? That's a huge success. I mean, just in terms of audience capture, that's huge. And these were pirate radio stations. This wasn't the BBC, which had like 10 bandwidths. This is little pirate radio stations. So once you have that much audience, there's so many things you can do. Tactical things, strategic things, disruption. So ratings is half the thing. Also very interesting is sort of behavioral change. So there's lots of stories of soldiers defecting because they'd listen to the radios. If we're talking more generally, on the Western Front, we had whole towns defecting, whole cities defecting, whole armies defecting. There's a very famous recent study which looked at the correlation between bombardment of cities, exposure to Western radio, so not just Delma, but BBC, the whole thing, and surrender in World War II, and it found that cities that were exposed to radio, so had good frequency, were bombarded, and that's very controversial. So if they had those factors, they were much more likely to surrender. Now that's very controversial because, again, we don't like to talk about mass bombardment of German cities we just don't like to talk about it in Britain. We'd rather forget about it. But some of the research seems to show that when it was radio plus bombardment, it did have an effect. Again, a lot of moral questions to be asked about that. So that's in terms of behavioral change. And then there's the third level of effect, I think, which is how the Nazi elites reacted. So they were freaked out. They were convinced, because the information quality was so high on Delma's radio about corruption and about rumors about the elite, that they were convinced they were traitors in Hitler's bunker. And they were constantly arresting people, accusing them of being traitors. So there's also that sort of level of messing with the enemy's trust. So I think that's three levels we can talk about of effects. But listen, measuring effects of mass communication is very hard. In academia, we've spent 70 years trying to work out if violent movies make people violent. And the answer is sometimes, maybe for a bit. So that's what we know about communication.
Mówisz o pytaniach moralnych, nie można od nich cały czas uciec, kiedy rozmawiamy o Delmerze. Jest taki jeden moment w tej książce, bo on zasadniczo wydaje się bardzo zadowoloną osobą z siebie, w tych wszystkich swoich wspomnieniach i relacjach na własny temat, ale jest taki jeden moment, kiedy zaczynają namawiać w dość pokrętny sposób, namawiać Niemców do popełnienia samobójstw. To jest ten jedyny moment, zauważysz to, że to jest taki jedyny moment, kiedy Delmer rzeczywiście mówi, że to, co robiłem, nie było dobre. Czy powiedział?
Shows some guilt. But the most important thing he feels guilty about is the consequences, because actually his memoirs are a morality tale. So in his many radio shows, he cultivates the idea that there was a split between the Nazi army and the Nazi party. And he's very, very excited when there's Stauffenberg's coup, because he's like, finally we get to push this through, and he's stopped from doing that by the government. But after the war, he sees his own radios being used as an excuse by Nazi generals to say, look, we always listened to Delma's radios, that was always about us, we were never part of Nazi ideology, we're just soldiers, and they become part of the new German government. One of them famously becomes head of the German Secret Service. And Delma launches a huge campaign against him, saying, why is this Nazi now in charge of the West German Secret Service? So Delma felt guilty most of all about that he'd created the idea of a Nazi soldier that was somehow not beholden to Hitler. And he thought there were risks to do with this, that people with authoritarian instincts would run Germany again and would see a return of German authoritarianism. And he spends like the next decade after the war kind of campaigning against the return of authoritarianism to Germany, of which frankly there was little chance in the way it'd been before. It's true there were a lot of Nazis in positions of power, but overall it was hard to talk about it as some sort of systemic risk to democratic institutions. And so Delma becomes kind of trapped in the fantasies that he created. I mean, it becomes a morality tale about somebody who created a fantasy world to win the war, and then is trapped in his own fantasies and trapped in his own nightmares. So he's not it's a book about Delma partly, but a book about propaganda, but he's not he's the hero of the book, but he's not a hero. And he would hate to be seen as someone heroic. He thought of himself as a bad person.
Podtytuł twojej książki Jak wygrać wojnę informacyjną jest zakończony kropką, ale gdybyśmy zamienili kropkę na znak zapytania, jak wygrać wojnę informacyjną w XXI wieku twoim zdaniem? Czy to jest w ogóle możliwe?
So listen, the name of the title of the book is at least partly ironic, because the minute you turn information into a war, you've sort of lost. All wars are tragic. The minute you start treating information as a form of manipulation, you've lost its potential for communication and for democratic discourse. And so in that sense, any information war is already a loss. However, then as now, we're not left with any choice, because the other side is doing it. And either we lose our democracies, either we become victims of invasions, or we start fighting back. And the first thing to do, I do agree with Delma, we've got to stop thinking that preaching about democracy will help undermine Russian mobilization. I know it myself, at the start of the war in Ukraine, I worked with Ukrainian activists and government to try to tell the Russian population about the war crimes they were committing in Ukraine. No reaction. Then we started to do, okay, they don't care about Ukrainians, let's tell them about the Russians who are dying. They're such great patriots. Maybe they'll care if Russian soldiers are dying. Didn't give a fuck. Because it's not a real patriotism they feel. They feel something that a Polish sociologist calls collective narcissism, which is the feeling of greatness from your country invading others, but it's just your feeling. You don't care about the others in your country, it's just a feeling of, it's like a cocaine high. So you don't want to listen to anything that makes you feel bad. And then the only thing that worked, that managed to undermine mobilization in Russia, we found, was campaigns that showed that crime was returning to Russia as a consequence. So Putin was releasing prisoners, they were going to the front, they were coming back to Russia, raping, killing, looting, return of the 1990s, chaos inside of Russia. That was the only story that made people a little less likely to send their relatives to the front, like 5% less likely. So that had nothing to do with what we cared about. It had nothing to do even with Russian patriotism. It had to do about something that they experienced very personally in a sense of disgust. And Delman was very good at working with disgust. So if we want to undermine the Russian war machine, if we want to undermine Trump's relationship with his voters, we're going to have to recognize, like Delma did, that these are people usually who do not care about our values, who do not care about values as we understand them. And we have to start to understand them and what will change their behavior, or else we'll keep on losing.
To chyba teraz, że zastanawiając się nad tym, w jaki sposób możemy zrozumieć kogoś, kogo też może nam być bardzo ciężko chcieć w ogóle zrozumieć, Czas na Państwa pytania. I widzę pierwszą rękę. Z mikrofonem, dziękuję.
Thank you very much. I'm a great fan of yours, starting from your first book I read, Это не пропаганда. And my question is, maybe it's a little bit silly, but what do you think nowadays, who would win, Delmar or Solovyov?
So Solovyov is a very famous and very unpleasant Russian propagandist. Russian propaganda feels so powerful because there's nobody fighting it. It is like a football game played into one goal. So someone like Solovyov looks very, very effective and very successful because there's no one even trying to do something systemic about it. Liberal Russian media are not competing for his audiences. They're not even trying to. They're not even pretending that they're trying to. They work for their liberal audience, and that's fine. Some of them are now starting to move into some stuff about war death. I mean, some of them do very good research, but they're not competing for that audience that Solovyov is preaching to. We know quite a lot about that audience. You can still do a lot of sociology in Russia, a lot of in-depth interviews, a lot of qualitative research. Nowadays, we have so many AI tools we can use to understand audiences. We know what motivates them. We know what psychological triggers inspire them. There's no one aiming for that space. And that's, we have in Europe many potential Delmers. Currently, they spend most of their time working on elections or undermining our own societies. So in Britain, we have this kind of evil genius, Dominic Cummings, who created Brexit and then sort of won the next election for Boris Johnson and then destroyed Boris Johnson. I mean, he's a man of vast propagandistic talents. I've always dreamt, why can't we take guys like this and direct them against a real enemy? Because at the moment, they're just like being used to destroy our own societies. America is full of demonic propagandists who are spending most of their time, destroying the last of America's cohesion. Can we not redirect them somewhere else? So we have loads of Delmers. The moment we will be officially in active competition with Russia, the moment there is a green light, the moment there is a budget, we will find that we're very, very, very good at being very, very bad.
Maybe we just have to give in that Cassandras or these good propagandists, it's inevitable that we can't win. Similar period, there was a Polish journalist, Rogowski, who in 1936 went as a journalist to Dachau. He obtained a permit to visit Dachau from inside, and he wrote about this for a Polish newspaper. Antoni Sobański, Polish aristocrat who had connections like Delmar in Germany, visited Germany in 1930s and wrote an entire book with analysis, meetings with all sorts of levels of society, and wrote a book, Civilian in Berlin, 1930s. He was present at Autodafé, not from distance, but he was there also like a witness. Maybe it's just inevitable that people who want to warn Cassandras, they are not listened. And like you say about the propagandists, the bad propagandists, they cannot be turned around to be serving liberal views.
Mamy też dzisiaj duży problem taki, że właśnie jeszcze w latach 30. dziennikarze tacy jak Delmer, czy właśnie wymienieni tutaj przez panią Sobański, mogli pojechać do Niemiec i jednak zobaczyć, porozmawiać, opisać. Tak dzisiaj właściwie pozbawiliśmy się dziennikarzy, czy zostawiliśmy też pozbawieni dziennikarzy po drugiej stronie. I to jest w ogóle bardzo kontrowersyjny temat. Co zrobić z z dziennikarstwem w sytuacji, kiedy nie mamy zupełnie dostępu, kogo słuchać, jak udostępniać sprawdzone wiadomości właśnie z kraju takiego jak Rosja dzisiaj. Jak widzisz ten problem?
So compared to the Cold War or the Second World War, we have more access than ever before. If you can't, firstly, people are still in Russia and there are still journalists there at great risk and they do great work. There's even still sociologists working in Russia. So it's not that closed. But apart from that, even if you've been banned as a journalist, compared to the 20th century, you can scrape data online. You can do psychographic analysis without even needing to do polling. You can use AI modeling to create synthetic audiences and think through different variations of answers. I mean, the amount, you can match attitudinal to behavioral data to see what people are doing rather than just what they're saying. I mean, the amount of data we have to understand individuals, societies, group dynamics. I mean, you can openly get information about anyone these days, like what pornography they watch, what their gambling habits are, everything they say. I mean, we have so much knowledge. And believe me, the authoritarian regimes are collecting that about all of us, all the time. If we even think through the consequences of the Chinese state having access to TikTok, that means that they're in a position to start ethnic riots anywhere in Europe at any moment. We know less about them, but there is so much data. So much data. So the idea is that we don't know is just absurd, and however much we know, they know way more about us. The only hope that we have is that despite how easy we would be to manipulate in a real conflict, and so far we've just seen some games on the sort of some little electoral games. If somebody really did want to do in-depth information campaigns against us, it would be very, very easy. The only thing that gives me hope is that because our societies are so open, we're also quite resilient. So we can react to these things. If you were to try to understand and do active communication into a closed society, they're actually much more fragile, I think, because they're not very good at reacting to things, because dictatorships are traditionally actually the loyalty and the sort of motivation in them can be very, very thin. That's the only structural advantage I think we have.
Czyli liberalna demokracja jest odporna na propagandę w finale.
So it's definitely not resistant, but it might be resilient, which is completely different. Resilient means that things go wrong. It's like a bone that breaks, but you can fix it. Yeah. So that's the hope that we have. I don't know if it's true. Is that because we're so open? Well, look at Ukraine. Ukraine compared to Russia is super open. Russia is doing campaigns in Ukraine every day. We see their effects. Right now, there's been a big campaign the Russians have done to spark hatred of migrant workers in Ukraine, so from Bangladesh. And that's been playing out the last 2 weeks, and Russian Telegram channels have been pushing this thing of like, Ukrainians, why are you letting all these foreigners into your country? Tell me if it sounds familiar. And it kind of worked, and very quickly society reacted to it. You know, people started talking about it, government reacted to it. So in the case, I mean, that's always been the secret power of democracies. We're super vulnerable, and then we can adapt. What happens to a dictatorship when it cracks? Well, remember Chernobyl, end of the Soviet Union. One huge story that breaks through, and the whole thing comes down. Look how paranoid Putin is. You know, because of 2 or 3 paranoid fantasies, he goes out and bans Telegram, thus undermining his own regime's ability to analyze its own society, to communicate with its own society, and to have that kind of backwards and forwards that you need to remain controlled. So he's undermined his own control by being a paranoid person. And the whole thing's shaking because of that. So democracies are much more open to manipulation, but we're more resilient. Dictatorships have censorship. They look more secure, but then they collapse very quickly.
W złych wieściach są też dobre, na szczęście. Ostatnie pytanie Aleksandra Zbroja, to jest pytanie, tak? Okay.
Did Delmer have any regrets about his own doings? Because he would write like horrific letters to families of deceased German soldiers, and I'm wondering about his. Did he write anything about it in his memoirs?
Yeah. So one of the things that Delmer did that was particularly nasty was So there were German parents who couldn't admit their children had died. And they'd keep on writing to the British government saying, I'm sure my son is alive and is a prisoner of war. And the Secret Services would give Delmer these letters, and he would write to them saying, I am your son, I'm alive. It's much better here. The British treat you so well. And sometimes he would even send champagne and food, saying, look how well I'm being treated. And the idea was that these parents would then tell others, and that would encourage people to defect. Kind of a crazy idea, and yeah, he writes in his memoirs that that made him feel bad, and he felt guilty afterwards. So that was one of the things he admits to feeling bad about.
Dziękuję Ci bardzo za rozmowę. Zanim się rozejdziemy, chciałbym, żeby Państwo poznali też osobę, która dzisiaj nas tutaj zgromadziła, przygotowywała. Aleksandra Zbroja. Bardzo serdecznie dziękuję Ci za ziemię pokazu. Po spotkaniu nasz gość będzie podpisywać książki oczywiście, a naszą rozmowę tłumaczyły Anna Kejnek i Karolina Wiązkowska na język angielski oraz język polski. Na polski język migowy tłumaczyły Emilia Szukniewicz, Natalia Litwiniuk-Karpowska. Bardzo serdecznie dziękuję.